The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and thank you for joining. I'm Trevin Martin, a Senior Marketing Manager here at Cygilant. Today's webcast is what you need to know about Spectre and Meltdown. Our speaker today is Neil Weitzel, Cygilant's Director of Security Research. Neil has over 10 years of professional technology experience in a variety of IT roles, from user support to advising security managers. He's an expert application penetration tester and trainer, and he's an active member of the security community, delivering lectures at DEF CON, OWASP, and other security meetups. As a reminder, all attendees are in listen-only mode, so if you do have a question, please use the question and answer tab in your GoToWebinar window, and we'll do our best to answer your questions at the end of the session. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Neil.
Thanks, Trevin. Hey, I want to thank everyone for joining today. I know everyone's probably heard in the headlines and such about Meltdown and Spectra, so we wanted to take this opportunity to kind of debunk any of the headlines out there, as well as inform everyone in the community about these vulnerabilities and attacks that are now publicly available. So despite the nice logos that kind of came out with these vulnerabilities, there isn't much to really freak out about. Keep calm first and foremost. While the impact of these vulnerabilities is very high, the likelihood of an exploit is exceedingly low. It does take sophisticated technical knowledge in order to exploit these vulnerabilities. Following a few of the mitigation techniques that we'll discuss later in this presentation will help you ensure that your systems are secure, or monitor your attack surface to ensure that if there is something that's an indicator of an attack, that you're aware of it and can act on it immediately. These aren't really big showstoppers, as I say here, despite all the news and media hype. However, these are pretty cool vulnerabilities from a penetration tester standpoint, because they do actually affect the hardware of the system. There hasn't been many hardware level vulnerabilities kind of publicly introduced into the wild for quite some time, so this is kind of neat from that perspective. So to start out, both of these vulnerabilities are drastically different in some regards, but they kind of are similar in some ways as well. So we'll start first with the Meltdown vulnerability here. The Meltdown vulnerability essentially will allow attackers to read any of the memory on the machine from any process on the machine. So if you have an unprivileged process, let's say your web browser or something like that, it could potentially read memory from like the kernel or privileged services running on the machine. This essentially is going to be using something that's modern processors will execute instructions parallel to one another. So they don't just do instruction 1, 2, 3, 4 in a succinct order. One piece of the processor might do process 1, and then another piece of the processor process 2. So these get executed out of order in some regard. And this vulnerability essentially takes advantage of that type of processing power in the CPU in order to kind of read what's been cached or what's already been executed by the processor. One thing to note is that there are patches from Meltdown. Meltdown itself, we'll kind of talk about what's available for Spectre later. But essentially, if you are running an up-to-date version of Windows, Mac OS, or Linux, you are patched. I'm sure everyone here is running something up-to-date, right? Either way, make sure that you are patching those, and we'll kind of talk about that a little bit later. So a little bit more of a deep technical dive here on what Meltdown, what the attack actually looks like. So on the left here, I've made a diagram of what a layman might look at for our memory breakdown within a machine. There are two segregated areas here, the user area, what a standard user may be operating on with their processes, web browsing, maybe documents, email, things of that nature. And then there's the kernel memory or privileged memory area that may contain things like encryption keys, data that's being processed by services, things of that nature. So this vulnerability or attack kind of gets launched by an attacker who will start a process on this machine that allocates a large piece of memory within that user area. So what they'll do within that process then is try to access that privileged kernel area. Now, typically what happens is that the operating system will say, no, you can't do that, and throw an exception or an error. But because of what we kind of talked about earlier with some of the instructions getting processed out of order, the data may be cached anyway within the processor or within how the execution happens. So then using that knowledge, an attacker may try to retrieve these areas in memory and see which ones are cached. And they can do this by doing some sort of time thresholding around these access parameters. So if an instruction is cached within your processor and your memory, and then you try to access it, it'll be significantly quicker than something it has to execute for the first time. So then by doing that, what the attacker will do is understand where that address in memory starts and be able to understand where the kernel memory is or where privileged memory is. After that, that attacker can then cycle through that location in like a subsequent order in order to kind of dump the whole kernel memory, which may contain things like your encryption keys, passwords, things of that nature. So within Mac OS and Linux, the kernel memory is not as randomized as it is within a Windows operating system. So it is a little bit less of an exploit in terms of its criticality on Windows operating systems than it is Linux and Mac OS operating systems. However, even though that's the case, it just kind of increases the time it would take to get the whole memory dump or find things of useful nature to an attacker. So this is a hardware vulnerability in itself, but right now the patches that are out for the Meltdown attack are addressed through a software level. Essentially what they're doing at a software level is removing the ability for the user space to access the privileged kernel area by just removing that addressable table entirely. What this means is that anytime that user process tries to access that privileged area, it just doesn't have any way to address that through any kind of table allocation or anything like that on the actual system. However, keep in mind that some kernel memory is still addressable, namely because it has to be for the operating system to work properly. So I'm sure many have read a few articles here and there, and may have seen that, okay, this is only affecting Intel chips, or this is only affecting certain processors or certain types. So I want to kind of curb that right off the bat here and say, the reason that came out was this idea of transactional memory operations in Intel processors. Essentially, you can think of that as faster. So Intel can kind of the Intel processors allow this parallel processing that we talked about earlier to execute much quicker than in AMD and ARM processors. However, since they both use out-of-order execution of processes, they're all vulnerable. It may just take longer on an AMD or ARM processor in order to kind of exploit this to its fullest extent. It's about 5 times faster on an Intel processor based off of its kind of execution policies. A lot of times in this realm, again, someone may say, well, what do I care? Why does it matter? What's in the privileged memory anyway? So if you have things like full disk encryption, or passwords running on particular services, or maybe there's data being processed on a server, perhaps like your Apache web server, your SQL database, things of that nature, all of that could be accessible in that privileged memory area. So now I want to kind of jump into what speculative execution is before we really jump into the Spectra vulnerability. So a lot of modern processors, well, all modern processors, try to predict your next actions. They do this through various learning techniques. We'll use learning in quotes there to kind of make sure that whatever the next execution may be in your subset of processes is readily available for you as soon as you click or perform some action. This is significant in performance enhancements. So it's definitely something that all modern processes are using. So essentially what happens is as the process is working through its stack of activities or actions, it says, all right, well, in this particular branch, which is called branch prediction, it'll say, all right, should I go and to execute action A or perhaps action B. When it performs that execution, it'll go ahead and run that code and then take a snapshot of the CPU. If you don't take that action, it's rolled back and it goes the other direction. And then if you do take that action, what it'll do is then once you make that action, it'll jump to where that execution exists in memory and go ahead and execute it for you, or just kind of play back the execution that it already took. So how this works from Spectra's point of view is that an attacker may execute some code, and you may think of this as perhaps from your browser, or some sort of Python Ruby script that's running on your machine. Less likely in those scenarios. However, the big attack surface I see here is possibly going to a website that has malicious JavaScript on it that has a process in it, and then what it's able to do is actually access other user processes. Now, where this differs from the Meltdown vulnerability is that you're not actually able to access the privileged kernel or privileged memory area. So you can think of perhaps you have two tabs open in your browser, and one of them is your email, and another one of them is another site that you're visiting. If that site that you're visiting has some sort of code execution on it, it may be able to read that other tab's contents or memory. So that may contain things like your session cookies or identifiers, or if you have other applications open in that user space, such as your email or data sheets, even your messenger applications, it could potentially read those data that's stored in cache as well. Where this is a big difference is that Spectre is not currently patched. They're working diligently to patch these vulnerabilities, but this is going to have to happen again at a different level. Because if you think of the operating system level where it has to segregate the kernel from running applications, this actually has to happen at a much different level with regard to many applications will need to be patched to make sure that things that go outside of the application sandbox or allocated memory area don't actually leave, in terms of execution or reading, out of bands. So, some browsers, which is what I consider to probably be the most, likely attack vector for this type of exploit, like Chrome, Firefox, do have site isolation mode. This doesn't fix everything, but it does make the attack a little bit more difficult. To kind of break this down here based off of kind of what I just said here, you can look at this table. Meltdown will allow you to read privileged memory, where Spectre will not. There are patches to mitigate Meltdown, where Spectre, there are no patches available yet. Both of these can leak user data memory, even though in the case of Meltdown, we talked about how we would probably access kernel memory. Keep in mind that if that's not available and then some segregation does exist, something that mitigates that type of attack, they could still potentially read other user application memory. Spectre is only going to be in the scope of what's in the user space. It is remotely executable. You can think on the Meltdown level, maybe like command injection, things of that nature, where maybe if I'm able to get like a reverse shell on your Apache web server, I might be able to do some things maliciously through Meltdown on that level. That would require a little bit more of a pivot type of attack, so it is less likely, whereas the Spectre one is definitely remote executable. The likely attack surface, again, here we just talked about, the kernel memory versus user memory. In the Meltdown scenario, the hardware that's affected is all of the processors. However, keep in mind that it's going to be quicker on the Intel processor versus AMD and ARM processors. Spectre will be the same on either processor because it happens more at an application level. So I want to dive into some mitigations here. This is where we want to spend the bulk of discussion and time, because as we're trying to defend and harden our systems here, let's talk about how we can actually make sure that these attacks aren't happening on our systems and how we're not vulnerable. So as we think about how we're going to architect future systems, we need to consider these types of vulnerabilities, not just attack in Spectre, but other ones that may affect microprocessors or hardware in general. Keep in mind that when you're architecting your environment, you want to segregate workloads that have sensitive information from workloads that have non-sensitive information. This will make sure that operations that happen more ad hoc on a less routine basis aren't going to access those workloads that happen around sensitive workloads or sensitive information. Keeping this segregation here will definitely help. And I mean not just from a different machine standpoint if you're running in a cloud, because perhaps in the meltdown scenarios that we've talked about there, if I'm able to get kernel access, that may allow me to break out of, per se, a hypervisor or a Docker container in order to get to the root kernel that's running on the host machine. So segregating those on different clusters or on different installations entirely are going to help mitigate this. Patching your systems is definitely something that we talk about very frequently at Cygilant, namely because it tends to be one of the biggest things that companies and end users can do to mitigate themselves from attacks in general. Most of the vulnerabilities that we see can be mitigated just by keeping patching regularly, auditing to know what your attack surface is. Like, these particular machines haven't checked in this amount of time. We need to go talk with the machine to make sure it's getting updates, or when it's going to be updated, or perhaps we need to monitor them differently. Also, don't forget to patch your web browsers. So, like I said about the Spectre vulnerability there, that may be the biggest attack vector for those types for that type of vulnerability, namely because of the prevalence of JavaScript, for example. So keeping your browsers up to date and patched will help mitigate these vulnerabilities as these patches are available. Similarly, don't forget to update your antivirus definitions and software. Right now, if you install the Meltdown patches, particularly like in the case of Symantec, there could be some system failures. This is because you're essentially changing how the operating system addresses memory. Since the antivirus software really works at the kernel level to access these areas, you're essentially changing that, which could cause your antivirus software to cause a system failure. So make sure that you update your antivirus prior to installing these patches, or read from your vendor that when the patch will be available, that makes sure that the meltdown mitigation techniques aren't going to bring your systems down. So at Cygilant, we can monitor running processes on your machines through various event logs and system monitoring. So what we try to recommend our clients do is create a whitelist of known good processes or applications and things of that nature, so that when something comes out of band from that whitelist, we can alert on that, investigate, and make sure that it's not doing something nefarious or it's not an indicator of an attack. Since we talked heavily about the browser exploitation level being a possible attack vector for Spectra and these vulnerabilities, make sure that you're uninstalling unnecessary plugins. If you're not using the plugin anymore, or if you haven't used it in years, likely it could be out of date or you don't need it any longer. And some of these could be the potential attack vectors for these types of vulnerabilities. That could include things like ad blockers, for example. One of the things that we're telling all of our end users to do is make sure that they log out of applications. So as we talked about earlier with the Spectre vulnerability, I may be able to use a process or a code execution in order to read contents of other tabs or cookies. If those are stored in memory in some regard, and I'm then visiting another site and I haven't logged out of it, that session cookie could still be valid, meaning that if I then load that malicious code and am able to grab that session cookie, an attacker may be able to log into my session and therefore kind of impersonate me on that application. Big rules of kind of thumb here to make sure that we don't open unsolicited attachments. This is something that is very common and you've probably heard a million times, but it's worth reiterating here. Minimizing the attached storage. So if you find a flash drive, don't just insert it in a machine. Making sure that you know what machines that you're plugging in, portable hard drives and things like that too. Make sure that you perform valid virus scans and purge or expunge all the data before you plug it into one of your machines to make sure that it is clean. If you're starting new or kind of using that for the first time, and then similarly, monitor your systems and alerts. If you know what the normal operating procedures are for your systems, what common events happen, what security events happen on a regular basis, it's much easier for you to determine if something is nefarious or out of bounds, perhaps an anomaly on your network or in your systems, that then you can act on, investigate, and see if it's something that needs to be remediated. That was pretty quick there, but I'll open it up to questions. I don't know if there's a way I can bring those up. Were there any in the chat, Trevin?
I don't see any yet, but we'll hang on the line for a few minutes if people want to enter them in.
Great. Well, if there aren't any, or if you think of some after the fact, feel free to visit our site or follow us up on LinkedIn or Twitter. We do monitor that 24 hours around the clock and able to respond to you there and kind of help you with either solutions or mitigation techniques, helping secure your network and systems.
So a couple of people have asked if we're going to have the presentation available after the fact. So we are recording the session and we will post it to the website. So we do have a question that says, besides monitoring processes, anything else SIM can do to help with mitigation?
For these specifically, not so much, just because it does happen at a hardware level, and SIM is going to manage or kind of monitor the application level a little bit more. So since this is affecting processes running on your machines and on your nodes, we kind of have to know what's running in parallel to those services that are critical to business. So that therefore, if something does come up or something does affect those areas, we can monitor those. Similarly, for like Meltdown, you definitely can patch from your vendor, things of that nature, and make sure that you're not visiting unknown or unverified sites from that regard. If you can block certain things at proxy level or firewall level to make sure that people aren't going to nefarious or known nefarious areas.
Great, thank you. Is there a concern with hardware encryption appliances and key management control, etc.?
Oh, you mean like a TPM chip and such like that?
It looks like it.
Yeah, since those would be loaded into memory, even though the keys itself are stored in the TPM module, a lot of times that's done on the fly within the application, and even on, like let's say you have a cluster set up with, like Zen to make sure that you have, your cluster, in your SAN encrypted on the back end. Similarly, that's going to be loaded in memory. So if I'm able to then use the Meltdown exploit to get to the kernel level and exfiltrate that key, I may be able to then use that combined with exfiltration of that data on the SAN to unencrypt that data and read it.
Okay. Another question, would a permanent fix be through a firmware patch or would it require a total replacement?
So, I know that the chip manufacturers right now are working diligently to come up with a, overall fix. So this is being addressed from the application level right now. Yeah, to do a permanent fix, it would be to replace that, but I'm not sure what you would replace it with. Since all major chip manufacturers are affected by this, AMD, ARM, and Intel, I'm not sure what route you would want to go.
Okay. We have another question. Didn't the US CERT first say that you needed new hardware, like a redesign of the chip?
That is what they first said, but they then released another update last night that has various updates for it from the either vendors of the software and a few checks that Intel and an AMD put out to make sure if you are protected or not.
Great. It looks like that's all the questions we have right now.
Brilliant. Again, if there are others or you think of them after the fact, feel free to follow up with us.
Thanks, everyone.